Perfect. Okay, off to a great start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining myself and Jen in our session on cloud computing in healthcare, challenges and opportunities. We've phrased this as a roundtable because we would absolutely love for you to engage with us, right? This is totally designed to be an interactive experience. I like to think that I don't bite. I know that Jen doesn't, so we're very excited to take your questions and hopefully give you really good, compelling answers and perhaps further questions. So the agenda for the day, or for the next 30 minutes or so, it'll look something like this. We're going to talk through a little bit about ourselves and the company. So Infotech Research Group, who we are, what we do, what we're doing here specifically. And then we're going to try and hit on these 7 or so trends throughout the course of our presentation. So we have a methodology that we use to approach questions about migrating to the cloud. I'm an infrastructure analyst. Infrastructure is very similar pretty much no matter who's using it. Of course, different people have different use cases, but broadly speaking, VM's a VM's a VM. So I brought Jen along with me, or rather, she brought me along with her, and she's going to be speaking in great detail about some of the healthcare, life sciences specific concerns and situations that you might encounter migrating to the cloud. So we're very excited to go through some current trends, talk a little bit about big data, security, interoperability, safe innovation, clinical system support, and of course, vendor reliance. And we have here conclusion and Q&A 5 minutes. What we really mean by that is we're going to talk about concluding and introduce a Q&A, and then we're going to let you guys go and ask as many questions as you can think of. Maybe they'll be relevant to the content, but if they're not, we'll take anything. I've been known to recite poetry off the cuff. Not good poetry, but it does occasionally happen. So introductions. Jen, would you like to tell the folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much, Jeremy and Jason, Jason's group, for having us this afternoon on this presentation. My name is obviously Jennifer. I'm a research director. I represent the industry practice within Infotech, and I have about 15 years of combined HR and IT experience, most recently in the field of healthcare. So it's an absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you and also hopefully having a great conversation throughout with Jeremy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. My name is Jeremy Roberts. I'm a research director, and I work very specifically in Infotech's cloud and core infrastructure practice. Now, we used to just call it the core infrastructure practice, but then this whole cloud thing started to happen. And so what I spend a lot of my time doing is working with folks, perhaps like yourselves, leaders in all sorts of industries ranging from life sciences. I just did an engagement with a life sciences member of ours last week, actually, right up to government, manufacturing, anything you can think of. So I've got a lot of experience dealing with the cloud in all its forms in different contexts and circumstances. I've written cloud strategies. I've provided advice on cloud deployments. I've interviewed and spoken with, in other capacities, cloud vendors. I've attended conferences. And perhaps when this whole thing winds down, I'll get to meet some of you at some of those events. So with that, I think it's probably a good idea to start by level setting on what we mean when we say cloud. Don't you think, Jen? That a good place to start?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. We didn't rehearse this, folks. Not kidding. We did a little.
A little bit.
So how is the cloud, or sorry, what is the cloud? How is it deployed, and how is the service actually provided, right? So we actually thought it was important to start here because the word cloud is thrown around a lot. If we were live and in person, I'd probably ask for a show of hands who's seen an ad for the cloud. It started to permeate the collective culture in a way that a lot of other sort of back-end technologies really haven't. So you see ads on CNN for IBM Cloud. You see ads in the airport for AWS that are vague and have pictures of things that have been drawn. AWS is how, build on AWS. You see Azure ads. And that's atypical for a lot of these services, right? And that can be a little confusing, especially for people who have to make big financial decisions about services to be bombarded from all angles with information about this thing called the cloud that's supposed to be really good. So let's level set. Let's use the NIST definition, which has been around for about 10 years. 10th anniversary is coming up, and talk about what the cloud actually is. So on the left here, you can see that the cloud comprises 5 key characteristics. Every single cloud service, ranging from a public cloud to a private cloud to a hybrid cloud to a community cloud, has all of these in some way, shape, or form. Every different type of cloud, ranging from a software as a service to a platform as a service, has these characteristics as well. And they're what make the cloud strong, but sometimes they also introduce some challenges that you as an IT or security leader are going to have to confront. So the first is that on-demand self-service. One of the things we love about the cloud one of the reasons so many people have spent so much money, I think Amazon Web Services did something like $40 billion last year in revenue. One of the reasons they make that much money is because they offer these services in an on-demand way. It used to be we had to go to a vendor and say, we'd like, this configuration, please, and they would send you a server. And you'd have to, plug it in, fire it up, load your applications and services onto it. No longer the case. You can go to a console, you can spin up and procure that resource very quickly and easily without actually having to talk to anyone, which is great. The prices are listed, you're billed hourly, or monthly or daily or by the second or the compute cycle. We'll get to that when we talk about measured service. But the point is there are very few barriers to entry. And that's the case for software as a service, platform as a service, and for infrastructure as a service, although the licensing models are usually a little bit different. The second key characteristic is this broad network access. Cloud services are designed to be delivered over a network, right? And usually it's the public internet. Most cloud spend with the clients that I deal with, especially on the SaaS side and a lot of healthcare clients, is over the internet, right? It's something in AWS, it's something in ServiceNow's cloud or Cerner's cloud or whoever the case may be. It uses resource pooling to keep costs down and centrally managed services. So pretty much every cloud provider out there is running a virtual environment, and you are sort of an abstraction that exists on top of their infrastructure. So you may be sharing server space with competitors, completely unrelated organizations. You wouldn't know about it, there are virtual walls up, but that's how cloud service providers operate. And this, of course, allows them to better manage their resources internally. Little exception here, some services might offer you a bare metal cloud, but generally speaking, the infrastructure is resource pooled. You're sharing a tenant with other, you're sharing an environment in a multi-tenant environment. We've got rapid elasticity. This is one of the key value drivers of the cloud. So this is the ability to spin things up and spin them down as needed. Some services are purely elastic. If you have an on-demand instance from AWS Elastic Compute Cloud, you stop paying for it, it just shuts off. And you don't have to pay any more money for it. There's no cancellation fee. There's no commitment expected from you. Some services like serverless services, AWS Lambda is a good example. They're just per call. Every time you execute a line of code, you pay for that. And so you can, there's functionally infinite capacity for you to take advantage of those services. And that can be extremely valuable for organizations that might experience high levels of variability in demand for their services. We see this with universities that have a boom around September when people are arriving back on campus or filling out applications or what have you. And then finally, there's measured service. The traditional architecture or the traditional method, I guess, of paying for and procuring cloud services was you bought a thing, you paid for it, you depreciated it over time, and then when you ran out of capacity, you bought another thing. With the cloud, you are billed for what you use. So the demand and cost lines should be relatively close. They should be tracked, especially if you're doing dynamic resizing and things. So that's one of the key benefits that organizations see, is that they don't have to provision resources for what's the word I'm looking for here? They don't have to provision resources well in advance and depreciate them. They can be much more dynamic and elastic, and they can do chargebacks and showbacks because they can attach them to specific resources. So we've got three different service models that I'll get into a little bit on the next slide very quickly. There's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And then we have a handful of different delivery models, and this is how you might consume the public-private, hybrid or community clouds. So a public cloud, very quickly, is a cloud that's provided for use basically by all. Pretty much any software as a service that you can think of would fit into this tent. Private cloud is one that a single organization or group provisions for use of single clients. So, if you were to provision, say, an OpenStack environment, and then your clients would be internal customers, that would be a private cloud. A hybrid cloud is some combination of the two that involves an element of interoperability, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. And then a community cloud is sort of like a private cloud that's provisioned for a group of shared interested organizations. So groups that might perhaps have the same mission and not compete with each other, so they pool their resources. And we sometimes see that with shared services, entities in state governments. I know Virginia's got a big one. The government of Canada has a big one as well. So if I just jump to our next slide here, we can talk a little bit about infrastructure, platform, and software. So I know that the tagline for this presentation was the future, and I think that this slide, it represents the past, but it can tell us a lot about what the future of the cloud actually is. So this thing called the cloud really started with Salesforce in the late 90s, and that was very much software as a service, right? we're going to run the service on our infrastructure, and we're going to sell you licenses. And that's going to totally upend the software delivery model. And it turns out that Mark Benioff and his colleagues were right back in the 1990s. Maybe 8 years later, Amazon launched Amazon Web Services, and that's sort of this premier infrastructure as a service provider. And that's basically just infrastructure components that they're selling to you. So that's EC2, that's simple storage service, that's Azure VMs, that's these essentially similar components to what you're purchasing on premises, but they're sort of operated in the cloud. And a lot of IT folks really like that because you can run a VM here, you can run a VM there. It's just really a pricing model and perhaps some additional latency or functionality concerns that might come with using the cloud service. And then in the middle, we have platform as a service, which is sort of like providing a tool set that can allow you to do custom development. So the customization exists below the application layer. But of course, you're still existing within a service provider's environment. So that might be something like SharePoint, potentially, depending on how you use it, or a platform for a content management service like a Drupal platform like Acquia or Pantheon. So we've got these three different delivery models, and they offer compelling and different value propositions. And so for my first bold statement of the afternoon, I'll say that the software as a service and platform as a service, we're seeing a lot of growth there. Of course, we're seeing massive growth on the infrastructure as a service side as well. You know, we're talking 40+% year over year for companies like AWS. But my prediction is that, you know, as time goes on, the cloud providers themselves don't have as much of an incentive to grow their infrastructure as a service businesses because they're relatively commodified at this point. So, you know, they can procure compute hardware, they can procure storage, you know, they can do that, but it's difficult to differentiate, right? Where the real money is, where the real differentiation is going to be in those custom software environments where they can lock you in those powerful tool sets that are, you know, custom to them, that are bespoke, that can lock, again, customers into their environment. So I predict that for healthcare and for other industries, we're going to see a lot more emphasis on the platform as a service and software as a service components here. Now,
Jeremy,
before,
we have a quick question from Sylvia that she's posted
absolutely.
in the chat. And so she's asking very simply, and I think you may have touched on this earlier, but she's asking about the cloud is really just a bunch of servers
Mhm.
and NAs in a network at a data center. So essentially, I think we can agree that yes, that's true
In a
from
lot of cases, yeah.
a physical infrastructure perspective. And then she's mentioning that she's transitioning from a patient centric to a marketplace centric maybe service
Mhm.
in healthcare. And so that is a model that is somewhat familiar to a lot more healthcare providers. And just to build on sort of what you were just saying around the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, we're seeing that as a definite trend within the healthcare space as
Mhm.
a model that's being adopted quite
Absolutely.
widely. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but I just
No,
wanted
no,
to address
that's a
that.
great point. Thank you, Sylvia, for your comment there. And I'll address that bit because that's a sort of common trope, right? This idea that the cloud is just somebody else's computer, and it is largely, especially a public cloud. I mean, a private cloud, you might own it, but it's got a sort of series of features and characteristics that make it separate. And so I think for a lot of folks, thinking about the cloud as somebody else's computer is a good way to sort of operationalize some of the challenges that you might face when you're dealing with the cloud service, right? So when you're going to procurement and saying, I'd like to buy cloud services, and they say, what are those? You say, oh, it's somebody else's computer. And that's a good way to contextualize it for them who might not be maybe intimately familiar with the details. But when we dive in, right, we can see that there are some differences between different models that have implications for you as an IT customer. So for example, Amazon AWS is indeed a bunch of server hardware that Amazon is running. They've got a software layer on top of it, and they'll allow you to use it for a fee, right? So that's very much in line with somebody else's computer. But so is perhaps hardware that you lease at a co-location facility. So is hosted software that's been provided for decades that isn't necessarily elastic, that doesn't maybe offer the same level of granularity. So, you know, if somebody else is managing a hosted application for you, but you can't provision additional resources quickly, or you have to call them up in order to do that, that's a little bit less cloudy than a true cloud service, sort of as envisioned by a lot of the, I guess, evangelists in the space, right? So I sometimes deal with members who rightly point out that they've been using sort of cloud equivalent services for a very long time, like terminal services or mainframes or what have you, right? That have sort of a centralized repository that people log into, and there are elements of that, but there are also some differentiators that make the cloud special. And I think part of the reason that this idea persists is because the vendors themselves don't make it easy. If you're a hosted software provider, you're probably going to come around and be like, actually, I'm a cloud provider, because you know that buzzword is maybe going to have a little more cachet these days than hosted software. But that's a fantastic point, Sylvia, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. And thanks, Jen, for bringing it to my attention. And before we jump into the healthcare specific stuff, I just want to give a little bit of context sort of on our approach to the cloud. That's my next slide here. We've identified these 6 risks, and we're going to be talking about them broadly throughout the rest of this presentation. And if you have any others that you think we didn't touch on that you want to talk about, that's a great use of the question box. So please feel free to fire those in there. At a high level, and these are in no particular order, there's data. What data am I putting in the cloud, and what restrictions exist around that, and what should I be worried about? Security and compliance. What do I have to do in order to ensure that I'm complying with rules and regulations? How do I make sure the service is available? How do I ensure that my infrastructure can actually handle a transition to the cloud? If you've got a 300 millisecond latency, 1 gig, maybe not 1 gig, 10 meg pipe, you probably aren't going to put your entire environment in the cloud. Skills and roles, what do I need to know? And then, of course, integration, right? How do I make it all fit together? So with that, I'll throw it over to Jen, who's going to talk a little bit about the healthcare value stream and relate some of this back to some of the cloud technology that we've been talking about.
Great, thanks, Jared. So really, at a high level, there's really 4 main activities that are performed within a healthcare context or within the healthcare value stream environment. Critically, we're aiming at preventing health challenges. So even if you look at it from a public health lens, the idea of prevention is quite pervasive. Diagnosing and treating healthcare needs as they arise, and facilitating and monitoring recovery. And so these are sort of like the high level outcomes of interactions within the healthcare system. And this really forms sort of what we call at Infotech our value streams, which we like to work at a strategic level to map varying strategic capabilities and assess those capabilities to these high level values. But as a point of context, when we're speaking broadly about the healthcare system, these are sort of the high level values that we're sort of organizing our thoughts around and trying to organize our research around. So when we look at some of the critical challenges and critical opportunities within healthcare, what we're seeing on our next slide is in terms of challenges for most healthcare IT leaders. In some cases, it's the basic, I need to keep the lights on. In other cases, it's integrating a lot of mobile or mHealth devices into their existing infrastructure and doing that safely and securely. In other areas, it's that consistency of investment and making sure that health services delivered equitably across the system. And that requires, again, a lot of IT agility. And certainly we've seen that play out during the pandemic, is that there's been a lot more emphasis on really going forward and launching things that were niche maybe a year or 2 years ago, like telehealth, telemedicine, and to agilely pivoting into those service delivery models quite quickly with a lot of security sort of being exposed. So I think once the pandemic sort of phase is out, hopefully, we will need to loop back and learn many lessons from that experience. And as well, sort of built in with that conversation around mHealth technologies, even furthering sort of remote patient technologies, and how do we do that again safely and securely within the context of healthcare delivery. So these challenges do lead to some opportunities for infrastructure in particular and security leaders in this space. I think there's been a lot of talk and hype around integrating more data analytics, again, achieving that goal of interoperability, using predictive modeling tools to better treat and diagnose, patients, and as well making better use of artificial intelligence. So in fact, last week, I think the federal government in the United States launched some grants specifically at expanding the role of artificial intelligence within EMR and EHR platforms. So that these are all areas that are up and coming and are trends that exist within the system. Our next slide really talks about stakeholder satisfaction. And so we do run a lot of reports with our clients to measure how well they're performing in a variety of dimensions. And we call that our CIO Business Vision Survey. And we run that for specific industries. And the metric that I wanted to highlight this afternoon for the group here in talking about the advances in mHealth and remote patient monitoring technologies, we are seeing that one of the lower scores of the clients that we've surveyed is that client-facing technology. So be it a patient portal, some sort of virtual care access point, even mHealth apps, excuse me, those are seen as from a healthcare delivery perspective, again, surveying our clients as a place where we can grow and where there's a lot of expectation for service providers to grow in the coming years. In terms of the landscape and what we're seeing within the landscape, again, there's sort of that balance that needs to be struck in terms of facilitating a fully interoperable system, but also securing the data and making sure that it's de-identified and that it's structured in a way that's useful for others within the system. And so in 2018, 32% or over a third of patients who went to a provider noted that there's still a gap in that information sharing landscape. So there's still quite a bit of room to grow in terms of sharing information within the system to ensure better care outcomes and to help patients from rehashing their clinical story or their clinical journey over and over again when they are participating in the healthcare system. From an innovation perspective, innovation in healthcare typically needs to be sort of undertaken with a lens of practicality and safety. And so although there's a great expanse now of telemedicine and over 200 telemedicine networks in the United States, and certainly great uptick as a result of the pandemic, we really need to look at how those virtual healthcare encounters are being given securely and that they are integrating sort of practical applications of providing a great care experience and that they're equitable across the system. So there's still a lot of gaps in terms of people being able to access virtual healthcare, gaps in terms of having access to physical hardware, or gaps in Wi-Fi networks and connectivity speed. So I anticipate that there will hopefully be more investment in those areas to facilitate that equitably across the system. And then from a security perspective, really, any loss of data within a healthcare context through a nefarious means is terrible. And so what we found is that a data breach is very costly for many healthcare organizations, and that these costs in terms of mitigating and responding to breaches are in the millions. And so that is something that IT leaders definitely need to be aware of, and certainly many in the audience, I'm sure, are already quite aware of the responsibility of securing systems and monitoring them so that they aren't breached. When we look at deriving benefits from big data, as an example, within healthcare, there certainly is a lot of opportunity in this area. Certainly from a cost management perspective, improvements in treatments and improvements in understanding workflows and service delivery. But there really needs to be more organization around data management processes and access. And as well, the volume of unstructured data from medical text reports, biometrics, there's a flood of information, but it's in terms of packaging it and analyzing it, there's still a tremendous amount of work to do within the system. The other area that we wanted to touch on was really, again, evaluating your risk before moving into the cloud, or if you already are in the cloud, things that you want to consider. And I'll just turn it back to Jeremy to talk about this piece.
Thanks, Jen. That's a really compelling look at sort of some of the intricacies that that the healthcare CIOs and other leaders that are in the audience today are facing. So our approach really is we say, okay, the cloud's got all these nice things that are good. There are things like big data, there are things like relatively safe innovation, but there are other things that you need to be cognizant of, right? So dovetailing, I think a little bit with what Jen had been discussing just a moment ago, that first risk that we want you to look at is data. What is the thing that I am thinking about putting in the cloud? What is transiting through a cloud service? And what are the implications of that from a regulatory perspective, from an internal policy perspective, from a doing the right thing by patients perspective, and from, of course, a usability perspective, right? What can I do with all this data? Am I going to have to change my data architecture? Are there going to be some complicated integrations? Am I going to have to come up with a really complicated workaround in order to ensure that I'm complying with data residency and retention requirements and things? And sometimes that can preclude safe and effective use of the cloud. Many vendors understand that the healthcare industry is a perfectly acceptable customer base, so they understand their needs and they work to ameliorate them. But one of the first things that I would caution anybody who's thinking about going to the cloud and who deals with sensitive data is to build a set of requirements and align them with what a vendor can propose or offer to you. And I think that that if you're able to do that, you can probably derive quite a bit of benefit. Some things will never go to the cloud. Sometimes in the life sciences space, for example, if you need to maintain chain of custody or continual uptime and drug production, it's more difficult to use that operational technology in the cloud. I encountered that last week with a client of ours. But things like personal information have been going to the cloud, and some organizations have determined that that is suitable. So it's really just a matter of making sure that you have appropriate processes in place and that you recognize what your requirements are. So on that patient information front, Jen, I understand you've got some content here for the folks at home.
Yeah. And just to Sylvia's point in the chat around developing strong partnerships and change management, absolutely. I think those are two critical points within developing out interoperability, and as well as even within your own healthcare system, those practical skills around change management and partnership building as an IT leader are essential. So thanks, Sylvia, for putting that in the chat. From a data security and protection perspective, there's been many breaches. So there's no shortage of recent news stories about how significant healthcare providers or payers have been breached between the period of 2011 to 2019, and even into last year, there were many significant breaches. One of the things, again, from a scare perspective, a traditional EMR record or an EHR record is, estimated to be worth around $355. So times that out by your entire patient population, and this can become a very costly thing to undergo. A lot of the times within security and privacy, but more on the security end, it's sort of it's not a matter of if, it's sort of when this is going to happen to you. And so putting those barriers or roadblocks within your system and within the context of your organization so that you prevent these breaches is a really crucial aspect of becoming a mature or business partner level IT leader within your organization. So going down to the fundamentals of security really is a great starting point, but then moving up that ladder of maturity in terms of thinking about new threats that are on the horizon and ensuring that your patient data is protected is really crucial. Because hackers are very ingenious individuals, and they will use any and all areas to come at your organization. So it's really important from a security perspective in particular to ensure that if you are moving to the cloud, that there are those sort of security perimeters around the information that you're storing at those locations.
Thanks, Jen. So I think what I want to do with this slide really quickly is just to say that the cloud is very much a different way of operating. It's not inherently better or worse. It involves an element of shared responsibility. So, I say up here, for all the hand wringing, odds are that large public cloud providers, they actually do have things in place. It's really about making sure that, you can trust them to actually execute on their promises, and that, they have the resources to continue to develop and address new threats. So shared responsibility is really the name of the game in the cloud. You hit the nail on the head, Sylvia, when you mentioned sort of building those relationships, understanding what cloud providers can do for you and what they won't do for you. Many of the breaches that we see across industries, Capital One, Target, they're not necessarily because a hacker, figured out an exploit. They're related to, human error. Somebody forgot to properly configure a firewall, or they didn't put a password on an S3 bucket. So a lot of the security and compliance things that come up, in my experience and with the clients that I've dealt with, have actually related to that human factor, properly configuring governance and things. So yeah, sort of in the interest of time, I'll jump ahead. Jen, you have a piece here on integration that's quite important, and I imagine that'll impact usability for many cloud customers.
So really, integration is at the core of developing a completely interoperable system.
Nice, I think that's
So
this one.
yeah, so just in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, there's been a lot of ideas around a truly interoperable system. If anyone's worked in a healthcare context, they know how difficult that truly is to achieve. I mean, I think even interoperability within a complex hospital network is a difficult thing to achieve. But I think that the goal of interoperability, as it's simply presented on the right-hand side of the screen, is that sort of seamless transition of data across many different providers throughout the healthcare system. The reality is that it's very difficult to achieve this. There's been great gains again over the past 15 years in terms of the adoptions of EHR and EMRs, but even those systems have come with a lot of pains, especially on the provider side, in terms of increasing their screen time and reducing their time treating patients or talking to patients. And so now where we're seeing sort of the shift in healthcare is we have this great network, be it even just within a hospital network. How do we connect it out to our payers more efficiently, given that we've seen a lot of advances in technology, but then also how do we leverage technology to improve care experiences between provider and patients? And so there are standards, and of course, we have the FHIR standards supporting more API development, and HL7 has been around for many years. But I would anticipate there's going to be more advances as patients demand more convenience in care, and as providers push back on sort of the load that has been placed in front of them from a technology perspective. So as IT leaders, we really need to think about new and innovative ways to present new technology and to make sure that it's meeting both our provider and patients' needs. And so from an innovation perspective, again, the expectations have never been higher. I think we are wearing Apple Watches. You might win one as a result of participating in this conference. The health kit data app on a thing like an iPhone watch is being used by many different non-traditional healthcare sort of tech leaders to take that data and put it into your patient record, or take that data and put you into a study. And so there's many new ways of transitioning health data through mobile devices to improve care. Again, it's just a matter of right-sizing the infrastructure and making sure that as we move to this more of a big data world, that we are able and have the capacity to support it in the long term. And again, we also want to think very much about privacy and security. So to underpin the critical infrastructure, that has to be at the heart of any new innovation that comes about. And if you're evaluating vendors, you really need to scrutinize how they're protecting patient data or how they're de-identifying that data if they're sharing it in a research study.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. So actually, it's a great lead-in, right? So this idea that providers are going to come up with a solution to help you be compliant. Oftentimes, they'll tell you, "Oh, hybrid cloud is the way. Hybrid cloud is the way. We're going to deploy a hybrid environment." And we have a picture of a true hybrid up here, a liger, which is a lion and a tiger. And there's a Napoleon Dynamite quote for fans of the film. And the reason we included this here is to sort of illustrate that a lot of vendors and even a lot of IT folks will say, "Oh, we've got a hybrid environment, or you should have a hybrid environment." But what they really mean is we have this disparate dispersion of different cloud providers, the multi-cloud environment, and we're doing our best to centrally manage it. So just a word of warning to anybody who's looking at exploring a hybrid cloud solution as a way to foster innovation. It can be quite difficult and expensive to set up a true hybrid environment. It might not even be what you want. So that would be something like VMware Cloud on AWS or Amazon Outpost, where they actually mail you a server and you can manage it through the AWS console, or Azure Stack, which is Microsoft's sort of equivalent of that, bringing the Azure services down into the data center. So just keep that in mind as you're exploring those innovation options. We had to throw this one in because we like the picture of the cat, and also because it tends to be, I think, a stumbling block for a lot of different organizations. The next thing I want to talk about here really quickly, mindful of time, is availability and reliability. So we talked a little bit about some of the risks that organizations face. This is a huge one. If you take your stuff, right? Let's say you're even comfortable putting all this personally identifiable information in the cloud because they've met certain compliance requirements, they're jurisdictionally appropriate, their staff have passed background checks. There are still a whole bunch of other things that can go wrong, right? And we like to say there's at least when internal IT is around, they can troubleshoot and solve issues. They can go into the data center and they can reboot things as needed, and they own the hardware. They can swap out a dead switch if they need to, that sort of thing. In the cloud, though, especially in software as a service, that doesn't exist anymore. Your ability to troubleshoot is limited, constrained by the agreement that you have in place with your provider, and perhaps that agreement isn't enough. So some just general pieces of advice here are, if you become an exception, you likely aren't going to get exceptional service. So have a look at the uptime guarantees, the SLAs, reviews and references from other customers to determine if the provider can actually meet your needs. And if they have a lot of similar customers like you that have good things to say about them, you're probably okay. But you'll want to keep that in mind. That availability piece, it's not always 100% guaranteed. And even if they do 100% guarantee, it might be on their terms. Like, we'll have 100% uptime except for planned downtime. But guess what? Planned downtime is still downtime, and you don't get to plan it. They get to plan it. You get to maybe plan around it. But anyway, that's just one thing to think about. And then a final point here is on skills, right? So I've pulled out the vendor management as an example of a skill, and we've got a little graphic up here illustrating what might be a little bit different in a cloud environment. But this slide really speaks to a broader concern, which is we have this new thing that's managed in a new way that enables us to access new, compelling, potentially very valuable services. How do we learn to do that? What sort of skills do we need to have? And are they directly transferable from what we have right now? So if you've got somebody who's an expert in managing a SAN, well, I mean, a SAN's not necessary in a cloud environment, right? So that there's some reskilling, reappropriation of that person's labor that might be necessary. Some services don't really exist on-prem in the same way that they do in the cloud, like perhaps serverless, right? So perhaps some sysadmins are going to need to learn some code to take advantage of AWS Lambda or Azure Functions. And there can be some difficulties around that. Some skills are almost orthogonal to their traditional skill, right? So if you're an Exchange admin and you're responsible for troubleshooting issues with email, and then you go to Office 365, I mean, you still do a little bit of that email troubleshooting, but you're going to be mostly responsible for managing a relationship with Microsoft and communicating SLA updates and things to stakeholders. And that's a different set of skills, and it might not be appealing to some admins, right? So these are things that we want to think about as part of that framework. And sort of as a final slide here, I think Jen, you'll take us through some of our key sort of industry differentiators, and then we'll do a Q&A. One of the things that we offer as a service here at Infotech is helping you talk through these challenges and concerns that you might have. So we've touched on a lot of things, and I think our session ran a little bit long, but we can talk about them in greater detail with more specificity for your organization if you have any questions, and we have a whole bunch of research on this. But anyway, Jen, here, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, so really, as Jeremy just said, at the industry level, and that's the team that I'm on, we definitely have products around reference architectures, trends, like we've discussed in this presentation this afternoon, benchmarking and reviews of top technologies. from a peer networking connection perspective, we also have experiences that collaborate other members in another roundtable type format and facilitate peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. And then as well, we have many templates that are boardroom ready that we encourage our members to use to share findings with their executives and other colleagues. So again, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I believe the next slide is really just around questions. And again, thank you in the chat for providing questions along the way. So we'll just open up the floor now to anyone who may have questions for us.
Yes, indeed. And we do have some questions coming in. So first and foremost, I'm just going to stop the screen share just so that we can all be nice and visible. Thank you very much, first and foremost. That was fantastic. Very thorough, very, very informative, as you can see by the acknowledgements and the comments in the chat box here. So some questions that have been flying in. How prevalent is AI machine learning in the cloud?
That is a great question. Do you mind if I take that one, Jen?
Yeah, go for it.
So it's sort of the fundamental underpinning of some of the cloud services and service providers that exist today. So think IBM, right? IBM started out as a traditional cloud provider. They had SoftLayer and Bluemix, and then they eventually transitioned to IBM Cloud. And they built this thing called Watson, and that's been used in the healthcare context to do pattern discovery and things. And for them, that's their differentiator. They say, we're going to be cloud agnostic, but we're going to give you this AI package, this AI platform that you can train up on your own data, and you can set to work on your own challenges, right? And a lot of the other infrastructure as a service providers do this too. They have AI platforms like SageMaker and AWS. Microsoft has one, and the idea is they have the computing power and the technical resources that are difficult for a lot of smaller, especially smaller organizations to marshal, and they can bring them to bear in a way that you just would have great difficulty doing as a smaller organization. So that's the key differentiator for a lot of cloud providers. And even when we look at SaaS, we see things like Salesforce Einstein. We're going to give you advanced analytics. We see things like cloud management platforms, like there's one called Zesty, and they'll use AI to actually project your spend and help you find opportunities to save. We see all sorts of even something as basic as Microsoft Office. I mean, if you go to Excel Online versus Excel on-prem, is it called on-prem? Excel for desktop? It'll auto-populate lists for you online that it doesn't do on-prem because they've integrated that machine learning functionality into the service because they see that as such a core differentiator. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, they'll say, don't reinvent the wheel. Come look at our stuff, which might meet your needs, and you can just bring your own data, architect it, based on your specific needs. But we've done the vast majority of the work for you. Amazon facial recognition technology. They have a service called Recognition with a K. Same idea. Let's help you apply facial recognition for hopefully non-nefarious purposes. So that all exists in the cloud. And so I would argue that yes, AI and machine learning, if you go talk to cloud providers, they will tell you absolutely that's where they want to be.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Another question here, would you agree that margin pressure requires new revenue growth and operational efficiencies?
So I think that one might be better for you, Jen, in the healthcare space, or is that, do you think, referring to sort of on the cloud provider side?
Sylvia, any guidance would be great.
Yeah.
Very quickly in the chat box, please. Is that in the healthcare space specifically? Or are you talking more about the cloud provider side?
While we wait on that, I'll just say the cloud providers are experiencing a ton of margin pressure because they're forced to continually drop their prices. It's the healthcare space that Sylvia's saying, but really quickly, they're forced to drop their prices. It's one of the few areas in IT where you see consistent, service price drops is in infrastructure because it's commodity. But anyway, Jen, do you want to take the?
Well, yeah, I mean, machine learning is one component of AI. There's also natural language processing. There's also sort of different. There's three elements, and our AI person that I work with will be very mad at me. But there's natural language processing and machine learning are definitely a component in healthcare delivery. Natural language processing is really aimed at the unstructured data within an EMR, sort of within a clinical record. Machine learning is doing sort of more of those bigger tasks around revenue lifecycle management on a payer side, taking on simple tasks that can be repeatedly done correctly is something that is on the forefront, and I think a lot of providers and payers are experimenting with AI. I mentioned in the presentation that the Office of the National Coordinator in the United States has put out a grant application. I think it's up to $1 million for healthcare service providers to integrate elements of AI into their EMR and EHR platforms. So it's receiving more attention from a federal government funding perspective. So I imagine with those funds available to healthcare providers that there will be more growth and more adoption of those sort of models of dealing with structured and unstructured data, I would say over the next 3 to 5 years. Hopefully that helps to answer the question.
We were looking.
I noticed.
Sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead. We were looking at the question on margin pressure earlier as well from Sylvia, and that has to do, I think, with do you think that healthcare providers are experiencing margin pressure, which requires them to do an element of innovation? If I can paraphrase the question.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there is a lot of pressure to adopt these types of models. Again, it has to come with resourcing. So not only just skills, people on your team that are able to stand up a natural language processing sort of algorithm within your healthcare organization, but they're able to support it over the long term. Or if you're working with a vendor, that you have a great relationship with that vendor that can enable that to happen for you. So I think there's a huge skills gap that is creating some of that pressure within the healthcare context, because there has to be a lot of upskilling to adopt these technologies into a complicated infrastructure landscape.
Excellent, thank you. Really interesting question just popped up here from Danny Jones. To what degree are inputs from nurses sought in coming up with ideas for application of technology in clinical settings?
Yeah, so I would say ideally nurses would be consulted as much as doctors. I think in practice, sometimes that does not happen as much as it should. I've seen a lot of nurses and nurse practitioners lead things like the adoption or sort of the rollout of virtual healthcare. I think it is variable depending on which type of healthcare organization you're working in. I think on the vendor side, I think they love to have clinicians come over to the vendor side to assist them in making their products better. Because ideally there would be that sort of clinical lens at the beginning of sort of any either app development cycle or workflow development, where you're choosing a technology and implementing it into your clinical environment. So I think there should be more input from nurses. I don't think there's nearly enough at this stage.
Thank you, appreciate that. Okie dokie, another one, comment and question kind of thing from VJ here. Even with cloud, we use VPC where the infrastructure is presumed to be restricted to our organization. Is that not the case?
It generally is, actually. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can leverage a cloud service, and I was actually just typing out an answer to that one, so I'm glad you picked it. I've been thinking on it. So basically, you can publicly expose, your IPs and stuff in the public cloud. Allow people outside the organization to access it, or you can lock it down, use a VPN, access, the VPC specifically, sort of walled off, right, and treat the cloud as an extension of your data center. I think that the challenge, or I guess the question is, to what ability, or what is the nature of your ability, I guess, to interoperate between those two environments, right? So having two distinct environments that are connected, so you can transit data and stuff between them, isn't necessarily the same as having like a hyper-converged infrastructure solution on-prem that will allow you to move a workload around very easily, right? So that addresses, I think, some of the security and perhaps authentication, compliance, firewall type concerns, but it maybe doesn't address some of the other concerns that might relate to performance and functionality and so on. But that in healthcare, actually, I've seen that exact model used a fair amount. People want a resource in AWS, but they don't want to expose themselves to any potential damage, so they'll lay down a VPN. Maybe they'll pay for express route, they'll buy a bunch of firewall software, and they'll just have sort of a private extension in the cloud, and that can be a very valuable use case.
Cool. Another concern that VJ talks about is regulations, for example, like GDPR, obviously, which requires data to be hosted within the EU physically. So how do you look at DR capability in that situation?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So your DR solution is going to have to comply with whatever, CCPA, GDPR, pick your privacy poison of choice there. I say poison. I don't mean that privacy is bad. So, let's say you have, a primary site on-prem, and in the event that you experience a disaster, you're going to fail over or reinstantiate in a cloud environment. Like, if that data is actually being stored in the cloud environment or is accessible, through the provider's environment or ecosystem or whatever, they're going to have to be compliant as well. I'm not an attorney or anything here, but I imagine that if it was a DR scenario and you were a critical service, maybe the judge would be more lenient on the fine if you violated GDPR in that case. But generally speaking, when you're procuring a DR type solution, whether it's a co-location, whether it's a site that you own just in a different place, because you're going to want to perhaps not do DR in place, depending on the nature of the risk profile of your organization. I think that you're going to have that compliance question. And the good thing about GDPR, well, one of the many good things, I guess, about GDPR is that it's big and it's very expensive for cloud providers if they get it wrong. So they're working very hard to get it right. So this is a sort of question that you could take to a Microsoft or an Amazon and say, I'm concerned about complying with GDPR, and they'll give you just reams and reams of documentation on how exactly they plan on addressing that specific problem. But yeah, basically your DR environment should replicate your premises environment pretty closely. And as long as you're compliant in one, you're likely going to be compliant in another.
Great. I'm just keeping the questions flowing here, guys. There's stuff to get through, and we're going to go to the top. We don't have a session immediately after to prepare for. So obviously, if you have to leave to get to things, I appreciate that, but we're just going to keep going with this. Some great ones coming in. Sylvia is consuming the Q&A. In healthcare, the uptime for the EMI is absolutely critical. At times, literally a matter of life or death. Do you feel the cloud can be up close to 100% with emergency services?
So I'll start on this one just sort of generally, and then Jen, if you want to gather your thoughts and offer maybe a little bit more healthcare specific response, that might be the best way to tackle this. I will say that 100% uptime piece, whether or not the cloud providers are capable of providing true 100% uptime, that's one question. But most of the folks that I deal with, whether they're municipalities who operate emergency services that, you don't want to call 911 and get a 404 error, right? So those don't typically go to the cloud for that reason. I have a colleague who says, the botulism sniffer at the hot dog factory, not going to the cloud. In the healthcare space, drug companies, again, that have a lot of operational technology on the floor, the potential downside of downtime is huge, right? I'm going to lose millions of dollars in this batch because I don't have a chain of custody or whatever the case may be. And perhaps that's a familiar story to some of our life sciences folks on the line. So that in and of itself, I think, just precludes even including that in the discussion, right? If you need to have that uptime, if you need to harden it, I mean, like, if you put it in the cloud, the public cloud, you're going to need to have redundant internet connectivity because everything relies on that connection. If somebody has a bad day in a backhoe in the parking lot and your EMR is down, I mean, that's no good. And the same with any service that goes out. So my advice in this situation is always to, actually solidify your requirements in great detail. We make a lot of assumptions in IT. We're usually actually pretty conservative people as far as those assumptions go. So if there is a true 100% uptime requirement, difference between life and death, a lot of the folks that I talk to wouldn't consider putting that in a SaaS without some very strong guarantees, or perhaps redundancy on-prem or something from the provider.
Yeah, and I think vendors will always say that they can achieve that, but I think inherently you want to be very skeptical when dealing with vendors for those reasons, for the reasons that Jeremy just articulated. I would say, I've worked with clients that have had that almost exact situation of the bad day backhoe, and they did lose connectivity. That was in a northern environment, and that's like even more crucial because they only rely on fiber in the north. So you have to sort of think of, worst case scenario to the nth degree. And I think just having healthy skepticism of what your vendors will offer you is really crucial, because likely they will say that they can offer 100% uptime, but the reality of that might be very different, and that could really destroy your reputation within your organization if you do, have an unfortunate outage, which again, in healthcare, you're always trying to avoid. Again, a lot of the members and clients that I work with are quite skeptical. Most, I think, tend to go to that hybrid cloud situation just for that reason. So just my word or my advice is just to have healthy skepticism when dealing with vendors.
Fantastic. Comments coming in there. Thank you very much. That helps, and thank you for your honesty. And I would like to second that. And I am just going to wrap now, just because it's getting to the top of the hour and people obviously have other bits and pieces to get to. So I just want to start first and foremost by asking the audience, wherever they may be, to join us in a virtual round of applause for our speakers, for their openness, their insight, and again, their honesty. Honestly, folks,